Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Catherine Desforges. I'm from the Independent Cinema Office and I would like to welcome you to the Cinema of Ideas. I just here really to tell you a little bit about the Cinema of Ideas. It's our new virtual platform. It's a space where we at the ICO feel that we can stream films, have conversations and talk to lots of different people about everything that we love about cinema. It's also a really important partnership that we have with lots of cinemas around the country. And it's a space where we feel we can be ambitious, we can be adventurous, and we can talk about all of the things that we care about when we talk about films. And maybe we can provide a space that's not necessarily always available in a formal program in the physical world. And of course, we're also well aware that for some people, that's not possible really to enter a cinema. So we really wanted to provide this platform and just show you work that we think is really exciting and have conversations with people that make work that we love and have conversations that we know are going to be really interesting. So thank you very much for coming here this evening. So I'm really, really delighted to welcome Margaret Salmon this evening. We love Margaret's work. We are so happy that she's with us. As you know, we are streaming her film, Icarus after Amelia, on the platform. It had its world premiere at the Open City Film Festival in London this month. And we're also showing Bird, which is a film that we commissioned with Lux in 2016. So for us, this is a kind of lovely moment to bring those two films together. I'm also delighted to welcome Laura Guy, who is a writer and curator. She's written a fabulous blog about Margaret's film on our website. So if you haven't read that yet, please do go and read that. It's a really wonderful piece of work and it shows such care and warmth towards films in a really wonderful way. I was just saying that when I read it, I just felt it was really fabulous. So please do go and read that. You might be able to hear my cat in the background, so I'm really sorry. It's kind of like got the live element. So I'm sorry if you're watching this later. It's kind of cat noises. So I'm going to leave Margaret and Laura to have a conversation. They're going to talk. And then afterwards, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. And so I will come back in then. But before then, I'm going to take myself out of sight and I'll come back in for the Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to you, Laura, now. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Laura.
It's so nice to be here and to have had the opportunity to think about Icarus after Amelia in more depth than I'd been able to when I first saw it over summer. And I guess, you know, it's a film that I feel like I've been with for a little bit of time because we know one another and have sort of heard about it through your reflections on filmmaking and through making it. And I guess I just wanted to, one of the things that I was thinking when I was writing about it in the last couple of weeks was that I didn't actually know very much, the film is such a sort of product of the kind of various interactions that take place for it, and maybe that's always true of any kind of filmmaking, but it stages those relationships in a really particular way. And especially with the women that who were working and living in Govan, who you encountered through this through the film, and I just wondered how you sort of began to establish those connections with the women that we see in the work.
Yeah, well, hello and thank you for your text, first of all. And yeah, it's good to be here. I think that's a long story probably, because this production lasted quite a while. I mean, I started it, you know, it was working in collaboration with Chapter 13 and the curator Christine McDonald, and the chapter 13 is a very particular sort of organization in that it's set within, they've worked very closely with the Pierce Institute in Govan. And so from the beginning, it was very much going to be a film that was situated in Govan, that was going to be made for and about, perhaps, or with the community there. However you want to define community, pretty much people living in Govan, right? So not people that knew each other necessarily, but people that lived near to the piers. So I'd set out to make a film. I was interested in feminist economics. I'd been interested in feminist economics for a while. There was a proposal I had written a few years back that Kirstine was aware of, that was more proposing a film about sort of migration and a sort of response to John Berger, you know, the John Berger and Jean Moore book, The Seventh Man. And in the introduction, Berger, you know, sort of flippantly says, you know, this book is about men. There should be a book about women. So at the time I'd sort of read that, and I was doing research around Jean Moore, and I'd done met him and filmed him. And I was interested in what would that book be, or what could a film be that was a response to that. So the roots go quite a few years back, actually. And then suddenly there was a sort of a commission to make the film for Glasgow International and to work with Chapter 13. And so I began working, started in the Pierce, and was very much supported by Chapter 13 in establishing relationships with organizations in the Pierce Institute, which I won't really go into too much what the Pierce is, but essentially it's a sort of hub where lots of different sort of charities and community organizations are based. And so, so I had sort of everything from the beginning. It was sort of introduction into all of those spaces. And so I worked sort of inwards, going outwards. And I started filming just before lockdown in 2020. And that was sort of some footage in the film is that from that period. So the film, the footage in the office, which is in Govan, in the finance department, the women working at their computers, that was done sort of the night before lockdown sort of set in. And also the Govan All Sorts Choir, which is the women singing in the kind of red space, which was actually a kind of recording studio that had very fancy lighting. So that was red light. And yeah, so those relationships were sort of already established. Then everything fell flat, essentially. Lockdown hit and I stopped, production stopped. And, you know, we were all just kind of still trying to figure out what was going on. And then it kicked back into gear about a year later. So then in spring 2021, I started sort of reconnecting with some of the women that I'd met. But the most meaningful kind of interactions, which were very much one-on-one, which might be the two mothers, and also Midja Yan, who is this sort of singer and a musician and educator who performs at the end of the film. Those were relationships that came for me just kind of going outside of the Pierce a bit and just even walking on the streets, going into shops. Mother Africa, which is the butcher that you see, you know, that was me just hitting the pavement, walking around Govan, speaking to people, asking if anyone would like to be in the film. I'm making a film about feminist economics, and having some chats. And then so women started coming forward. But it was very much, it was very spontaneous and interactive. There was nothing, there was no set plan, except that it was all sort of situated in that location.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting how it sort of takes you back to the street as a kind of documentarian, because I was thinking that you know, so many of your films have kind of touched on forms of work and labor that have sort of historically been kind of, and you know, continue to be sort of devalued and exist, you know, as a kind of women's work, and that those like often those films have taken place in, I mean, as does Icarus, taken place in sort of domestic settings, but there's something in Icarus After Amelia about the kind of civic and about the way that like feminist economics seems to invite us to think about the women's work across spaces that might be sort of typically thought of as kind of public and private ones. So the film seems to have this kind of movement from you know, from these kind of more public kind of settings of work into a kind more and more into a sort of into a kind of interior.
Yeah, and that's like, that's an interesting, you know, that's a privilege of the filmmaker, right? And the camera grants access to all sorts of spaces in many ways. So there's a sense of like, you know, I am really interested in street filmmaking, and this, you know, I come from a tradition of street photographers, and, you know, thinking of Helen Levitt or even of Mary Ellen Mark and that film from Seattle that was, I think it was called, oh God, what was it called? On the Street. But it was pretty much just actually a sort of group of homeless children living in Seattle. That's an extraordinary film. And it's very much this kind of negotiation where you sort of just meet someone in this shared space, and then are invited into their home, you know, or you sort of build a relationship where then you have the privilege of meeting them in a different space and seeing what's behind the exterior, you know. And so that's the beauty of filmmaking, and also sort of, you know, nonfiction in some ways, that you can move between those places. But certainly, you know, as a kind of American, you know, I'm interested in the idea of main streets, right? And this idea of this kind of like artery that might be a kind of, you know, kind of gay, you know, the kind of causeway or whatever, some sort of like channel through which all kinds of things happen in a community, you know, people kind of meet and interact in ways that you wouldn't normally say if on back streets or side streets or whatnot. So that kind of collision in that space is interesting. And there is a kind of footage of, you know, the Pierce and also sort of like Main Street Govan in a way that is in the film, you know, and then I'm sort of situated there as well, making the work. And so it is like, it has this film more than, well, maybe other films have as well, or yeah, very much in response to a very specific time and place. And this really goes for it in the sense that like we're even above the place. It's sort of obsessive in its kind of documentation or its regard for this particular place.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of like almost a sort of forensic gaze that the aerial shot kind of enables as you sort of get closer and closer, and these sort of scales begin to get quite distorted, I guess, which was something that when you first showed the film in the context of the exhibition in the Pierce Institute, you showed it alongside sculptures where there seemed to really be a kind of play of scales sort of taking place that sort of emphasize these different kinds of gazes that the film is activating, or is being activated with.
Yeah, and I think about that a lot, you know. I'm sort of interested in this kind of, there's a sort of optics at play, but it's an ideological optics, right? So it's about sort of like pulling back, big picture thinking, and sort of then, you know, sort of detailed thinking. And so this tension between the big picture and the detail is really interesting. To me, you know, I'm assuming to everyone, and you know, and we straddle that in our daily lives because we sort of live within systems which are large and expansive, and when we abide by rules which are set, you know, for the big picture in some ways, but then we also make these kind of detailed decisions which are very much about our lives and how we want to live. So this negotiation, I think, is, yeah, it's becoming more and more present, and maybe a bit of lockdown or COVID, you know, has really sort of pushed that more into the forefront of how I was thinking. And certainly this idea, you know, the premise of the film, thinking about feminist economics, which are sort of like, what are these two words doing together? You know, and why do they need to exist? And so there's a sense of like economics being this kind of, you know, this framework which sets horizons, you know. And so like the idea of the aerial, the footage of the aerial footage, and thinking about Amelia Earhart, and just think, you know, opportunity, you know, and then the figure of Icarus, it was all kind of me just thinking about horizons. Who sets the horizon? You know, what's up and what's down? And sometimes, don't know about you, but sometimes I think, well, actually, I want down to be up and I want up to be down. This would suit me better, you know. But we all kind of like, who decides what that is? So that's part of like being in a community and being part of a you know, a world. Right, but it's also, how do you live day to day in that, and particularly how do you live day to day in that as a woman?
Yeah, one of the things that really, like the film really impressed upon me, and also how that was extended to this kind of the installation that you sort of showed it within. Was, yeah, that this tension between these different scales, or these sort of different ways of looking, but also how that might relate to kind of to sort of narrative and then experimentation within your kind of within filmmaking. So you know, on the one hand, the film's really structured by this kind of flight and this sort of, you know, the kind of linearity of that sort of journey. And then on the other, it has this sort of temporality, which is so informed by repetitive action and repetitive labor. And in the exhibition, there was a direct reference to Jean Dielman, and you know, to this, a kind of feminist filmmaking that has made women's work a sort of formal device, or a sort of aesthetic.
Yeah, it's a building attention, you know, it's a form of attention, and yes, it's about establishing a kind of power relation where that the thing that's being done by the woman is a powerful act, you know, that it deserves attention and actually recognition, and so cinematic attention, you know, the film camera and the film running through the camera is valuable, you know, it costs money, it's committed. Do you know what I mean? It's not just throwaway attention. And so, yeah, when I remember when I was editing, you know, the film, and each sequence, you know, sort of observing different women working, doing different jobs in Govan and along that high street, you know, for the most part. And then later on in their homes, or even singing a song, it felt like, no, you can't cut. Like to cut into their action was a form of violence in some ways, or it was a dismissal, you know. So it was like, I think it is a you know, in this case, and certainly when I was thinking of Ackerman, you know, it is it's a rebellious act. It's like, you're going to sit down, you're going to fucking watch her make that food, you know, she's going to make the meatloaf, and we're going to watch her do everything because it matters, you know, she matters. and you know, we're going to sit there and we're going to bask in that, and actually it's interesting, and she's interesting and valuable, you know. And so yeah, that was sort of what I was referencing, though there are always like technical constraints, and there was a certain amount of time, God forbid if I had, you know, I don't know, 1,000-foot loads for the camera and I can just do 7 or 12-minute takes, then you'd be like hours of footage.
I don't know what a 1,000-foot load is.
Don't worry about it. It's very heavy. That's what it is. It's very heavy.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of labor of making the work. I think one of the things that I really appreciate is that with the film is that I don't think it's like all of these different kinds of labor are sort of valued, but they're not treated as though they're kind of one of the same. Like I think there's a lot of like differentiation going on between different kinds of sort of activities, and where one might sort of also find like joy or something, especially in the sort of singing in 2 parts of the film. It's really interesting thinking of value in relation to this kind of work which has been historically devalued, and that's one of the kind of, has, as I understand it, been one of the kind of aims of feminist economics to look at the ways in which work is gendered and certain kinds of work devalued in particular ways. Do you think there's a danger in kind of in making this kind of repetitive, or some kinds of repetitive work, beautiful? Is that something that you ever or that you were sort of thinking about when you were making?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, because the film was shot on 35mm, and it was on a camera I hadn't used before, so I wasn't entirely sure what it would look like, and I didn't really have budget to kind of do tests or things like that, so it was quite a risky undertaking, but I think there were a few different things at play, and I mean, I am interested in beauty. I'm interested in using 35mm to film places and people and actions which maybe aren't traditionally seen on 35mm. So there's this sense of and maybe this is just me being romantic, but there's a sense of a kind of an early kind of adherence to a kind of realist politics that's a bit like, you know, these everyday people deserve to be seen on large scale as kind of academic paintings. Do you know what I mean? I'm going to put my uncle's funeral there, whatever. And so there's a connection there to Ackerman as well, in the sense of the quality of the attention, right? So, I also feel really strongly that beauty is not, there's no, how would I say, you know, beauty's up for grabs. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to us all. So there's a difference though in romanticizing, or sort of like maybe glossing over something, or overly aestheticizing something, which might somehow detract or disrespect the kind of gravity of the thing that you're filming. And I think there's a tension there, but I try to kind of manage, you know, to kind of edit. It comes out maybe in the edit, in the way in which you position shots together, or you might use sound as a kind of source of dissonance, or sort of to kind of undermine some of that imagery or question it. So, you know, the film becomes about image making and representation as well. So it's sort of self-reflexive, but I do feel strongly that that I want my subjects to, you know, also be happy and proud to be filmed. So part of that is also like thinking about things positively. Like these, these women were all, I mean, I know this is a bit corny, but they were all quite impressive and incredible and very generous people. So it was also a sort of celebration of that too, and then there's also a sense of, the camera and using this kind of analog camera that is has a particular kind of quality to it, that there's a sort of reappropriation of that, the idea of using these kind of tools, which may not have been widely used by female filmmakers, or, as I said, for certain subjects, and then just kind of performing. It's a performative act of reclaiming some of that language, because the camera is a sort of linguistic tool as well. You're describing the world in a particular way. So that camera in particular, I felt really excited to use it. And it wasn't easy to use. It was like heavy and awkward for the most part. But it felt like also that was my labor,
Yeah, it was, I said this to you previously, but that sort of moment in the film where you're shown with the camera, and it looks like one of these sort of very iconic images of, think of filmmakers in the kind of 20th century, or the sort of, auteur filmmaker. But thinking at that moment that I was so pleased someone was helping you film, because because you were shown on screen, and then the mirror kind of falls away and you realize that it's there sort of seems so much sort of bound up in that kind of moment, thinking about the position of the filmmaker and of her relationship to place, and to sort of situating herself within within the sort of form of a work, that sort of single moment is sort of doing. And I suppose it's also feels like a gesture which kind of references a sort of history of feminist filmmaking as well, like of the mirror and the self-portrait. And
yes, yeah. I mean, I love the photo. I mean, there's the mirror particularly, and also even in feminine, in female photographers, and the self-portrait, and but also I love the images of Barbara Hammer with her camera. That's always one of my favorite, my go-to shots, for inspiration. So yeah, it was nice to do that. But also, it is a marker, right? It's a sort of stake in the ground that says, I was here, this is how this all happened, and this is a construct. Do you know what I mean? It's a film.
I was thinking of the sort of relationship between Bird and, seeing Icarus and Bird side by side, and that there's a lot of kind of quite playful connections, in terms of the sort of aerial gaze and flight and the bird. And, I kind of let myself go down those, sort of think through some of that, because of the kind of playfulness, I think, in some of your works. And Bird, you've written, is influenced by the Children's Film Fund, and I suppose I was sort of interested in this that there's a sort of educational, maybe documentary, or sort of it is often kind of bound up as in ideas about sort of education and pedagogy as well. But I wondered whether that also feels like it's a kind of part of Icarus in the sense of like your own learning about feminist economics as you kind of make the film.
Yes, the two are interesting in that sense as companions, and certainly, like, I am really interested in instructional films, and I think that, I mean, we're talking at this platform, the cinema of ideas. Cinema is a kind of ideological beast. You know what I mean? It's like, no matter how deeply something's buried, I think, you know, you can always pull out some remnants of some presence of some power relations, or some idea of information, or a text, right? So what's wonderful about Bird is that that film in many ways was pivotal, in that it was a commission that also allowed me to kind of piggyback some of that funding onto making my first feature film, which was Eglantine, and that, so it was made in conjunction with that. And at the time I was very interested in children's learning in particular, and the work of like Mary Field, who was a kind of natural history sort of film producer who worked with different filmmakers making sort of these nature documentaries, you know, which are sort of informative, but actually, you know, we're a bit crazy too, a bit, you know, experimental films in some ways, in terms of the techniques and whatnot. But I think also what I rebel against is this notion of, you know, a kind of authoritative voice. And, you know, in certainly in Bird, there's a bit of a tongue in cheek, you know, this sort of, it was commissioned to show in cinemas, and I thought, oh, I'd love people to watch this and actually learn the names of birds that they see. So like, I actually literally did want them to know what a blue tit is, or great spotted woodpecker, you know, but in the midst of doing all of that, it became slightly ironical and, you know, a bit tongue in cheek, and also ended up being a kind of, maybe a sort of small, you know, there's this kind of meta narrative about, you know, humans and animals going on, you know, and a kind of ecological kind of tension between sort of, you know, the birds and their sort of captor, this bird ringer who ends up being kind of bloodied by one of the birds, you know. And then later on, there was the second part of that was this kind of thinking about the camera and the act of looking and not seeing, you know, and in the woods trying to find birds or to see things, but you can't see them, they're camouflaged. But there's a kind of argument that you can hear so much when you're in the woods, but people don't necessarily go to the woods to hear things, you know. So there was this, at the time I was really interested in using other senses as a way in which to kind of interact with the world, and in particular kind of natural world, to not just rely on the eyes. And I suppose Icarus in that way is the same, you know, it's questioning a kind of this kind of assumptive idea that, you know, economics is all seeing, it does what we need it to do, it's functioning, you know, but actually it's not, you know, and there's lots of potholes in its ideas, you know, and even still. And so, you know, my interest in feminist economics and also showing this kind of lecture, which, you know, was in my studio, I filmed it, and it was Professor Sarah Cantillon from the Wise Centre for Economic Justice at the Glasgow Caledonian University, and she had sort of, I asked her to make a kind of introduction to feminist economics, to just outline some of the ideas, but it certainly is just an introduction, and there's so much more in that. And, you know, on another level, I think it was also about, you know, about this particular time and what we're doing right now, and this idea of like the Zoom event, or, you know, the kind of communication through the computer, this interface. And I really wanted to film that on the camera, and to sort of like also embed that as a thing that's sort of happening and happened, you know. So yeah, seeing the two of them together is quite, there is a nice connection there, in the sense of an interest in learning, or perhaps unlearning or relearning, and this tension, which is, you know, I think will always be something that's in the work that I make.
Thanks. We have some time for questions from the audience. I think Catherine is going to
Yes, so if you have questions for Margaret and Laura, do you want to put them in the
the Q&A box, and then hopefully some you can send them to me. Just we've had a comment, it's not exactly a question, but somebody has written that the idea of an artery, I think you talked about Main Street at the beginning, made them think of Agnes Varda's daguerreotypes. So
okay. Because there's also film, I think. I've always wanted to see it. I think that is this the film that Agnes Varda made about her street where she lived? Yeah. I have a dream of making the Main Street is something that's it's growing into a bigger obsession. But I know that work by Agnes Varda is of interest as well. Thank you.
How did you find making films in the pandemic? How did you find that? Was it that kind of easier or more difficult?
I think yeah, this was a different project because it was usually I might shoot in a very condensed period, and you sort of you go out and you just expend so much energy, and you shoot, and then you come back and you edit eventually. But this was much more kind of like in sporadic sort of start and stop, and it was very much integrated into my kind of everyday. So, I mean, what was ironic about the whole thing was that myself and even the curator I was working with, and, we were all sort of like single moms, essentially, like, sort of navigating lots of this kind of, lots of the issues and the things I was thinking about. So there was a sense of like juggling childcare, juggling finances, and then on top of it all, just trying to navigate how to work with people under these sort of COVID, under COVID rules, and seeing what people were comfortable doing, filming with my mask on, which would then fog up my eyepiece, all kinds of things like that. But I think the biggest shock was actually my own sense of like amnesia as to like, how do I make a film, and even just really basic things like where the first shoot I did, which actually was filming the woman sewing with Maria Fusco's voiceover of her text in the film, and just me kind of rocking up with all the gear on my own, thinking, oh, I can carry all this and I can record sound and do everything. And I was just like, what am I thinking? I need help. I need someone else. But, because of COVID, it was a bit like, oh, I can't have anyone else. I've been on my own in my house all this time with my kids. The idea of working with someone else seemed like such a leap. So it was just sort of starting to understand that I could find ways to, eventually Jen Martin, who's assisted me in the past, came along and helped. And the two of us, were able to kind of carry everything and navigate all the different scenarios. So it was still a very tight, small production, which suited the COVID restrictions, right? But it was just even, the sense of isolation and not feeling like I could even, I had to work alone because that was how I had been for that long. That was a bit of a surprise.
And must have been quite different. I wonder if do you think that sense of like, those restrictions that were put on you in that way, like you said, you wouldn't normally have to be doing all of that alone, and you weren't necessarily able to kind of assemble people around you. Do you think it meant that you made a different film, than a different kind of film?
Yes, yeah, so certainly. I mean, I think you could see threads of like connections to like my previous work and this interest in like individuals and sort of portraiture and faces, but yeah, I think there was something also a bit more kind of each meeting was, I mean, this maybe is a bit corny, but each meet, it was quite significant because I hadn't really been in people's homes until then. So the idea to have access to see someone else's house or to you know, I mean, Midja like cooked for us and made some food, you know. By that time it was, restrictions had been lifted, so it was a bit more free, or some restrictions had been lifted, but you know, there were lots of like instances of things that I hadn't really done for over a year, you know, so that was quite significant. And I'm certain that it affected the work. Yeah.
Interesting to think of it alongside the other work that you made in lockdown, Lens Diary, and that really, you know, that was made over sort of a 3-day period, and really is a sort of reflection on technique and questions of representation, and maybe similarly around kind of labor, and you know, this sort of quite complex relationship between sort of labor and visibility, through the work of this community centre that was providing food packages during the first part of lockdown, I think it was. And when I saw that, I really thought, I was like, oh wow, Margaret's really equipped with some tools to sort of go into, you know, this sort of situation that requires a degree of kind of urgency, but to make a very sort of critical and kind of reflective piece from out of those kind of out of that situation. Whereas Icarus is, yeah, like as you say, the sort of temporality is kind of much longer and much slower, and even where there are shots of the sort of activity at the kind of, I don't know, the pantry, so the sort of kind of food bank that was operating at the Pearce Institute, there's the attention's very different to that other work.
Yeah, there is this there's such a radical difference in you know, and that was so interesting doing Lens Diary and like thinking about stills as again, you know, and the stills were a way to kind of like be there, be present, but not so present that I was in people's space, you know. And thinking about distance and the ways in which optics was kind of negotiating that, the lenses, was really helpful. And then I think by the time Icarus came around, you know, there is this, that's the difference between street photography and street filmmaking. You know, you can, like, the kind of shooting from the hip is not really possible with a camera. You are present. You are literally, you know, the footage is me spending time with people, with using the camera. So it's like that's real, that time that we were together, you know, 24 frames per second for 3 minutes or whatever it was, is a marker of something, a measure of a life, right? Which is so different from the still, which is just, you know, 1/25 of 125th of a second, and just it's gone. And yet it's so vast, right? It contains so much. So yeah, it's fascinating, the difference between those two works, I think. Yeah.
We've got another question. At what point did Amelia Earhart come into the film's narrative?
Yeah, great, thank you. I mean, Amelia Earhart, so it was quite a few different things, but I should give credit to Maria Fusco, who I was speaking to about the work, and I just kept thinking about Amelia Earhart, and I was thinking about Icarus, and this idea that, you know, the story of Icarus is that Icarus is given wings, but told not to fly too high, you know, and it seemed this kind of metaphor for a kind of condition that maybe women in Britain might be kind of experiencing, you know, this notion of a glass ceiling, or that you're sort of you might have access to education, or you might have access to all these different things, but still there's sort of, you know, you might then end up having children and not being able to do those things suddenly. So there's all these kinds of wings, or this kind of wax, which just melts over time. You suddenly realize, oh, I can't do all those things I wanted to do. And maybe that's the same for everyone. It probably is, but there seems something quite specific about the female experience, it's sort of a gendered experience of that. And so I was talking to Maria about Amelia Earhart, Icarus and some of the basic ideas of like Amelia Earhart sort of disappearing, you know, another story of like someone who has kind of access to wings, who has access to the horizon, but ultimately, you know, there's something about her story that's quite moving, and that maybe resonates in some way about a kind of invisibility, you know. And so then Maria told me about when Amelia Earhart had landed in Derry in Northern Ireland, and that she had spent the night with in a farmer's house in Derry, and then had kind of spent that night and then ended up flying to Paris the next day and finishing her trip, her transatlantic flight. And then I did a little bit of research, and I found this text by it's, I guess, Mrs. Gallagher, who was the farmer's wife in Derry, who then recounted for, like, I guess, BBC Ulster later on, a few years later. So this is like 1932, and then I think the other thing, I'm looking at my notes, it's like 1935, when this testimony of Mrs. Gallagher talking about hosting Amelia Earhart. And I thought the two women were just extraordinary in their, you know, one in the sense that they're these kind of ghosts from the past, right? They're sort of these voices, they're very much alive, like in the text of the film, but they're, you know, they're archival voices, they're voices of women that have passed, they're voices from the past. But they felt so relevant because Amelia Earhart's sort of describing her flight, but she sort of just writes it off as not very important. You know, and the way she's describing it and her achievement as being just, you know, it's just like, it was just another, wasn't very, you know, it was just for herself, it wasn't so significant, you know. And so the way that she kind of undermined her own ability and skill in her testimony, and then later on Mrs. Gallagher talking about how she came and then she hosted, you know, she thought immediately how to feed her. She needed food, she needed you know, she needed rest, and this kind of system of care that kicked in through Mrs. Gallagher's kind of presence of mind, where she figured out, you know, and so this intersection was extraordinary. And I thought that, you know, it seemed like a way to bookend the film in some ways, to kind of leave things a bit open, you know, about what the future is for sort of us all, but also for, you know, younger women sort of thinking about their horizons and what's out there for them. And then the last thing is just very quickly, the night I flew above Glasgow was actually the same night that Amelia Earhart would have been flying from Derry to Paris. And I'm not joking, it was a complete coincidence. And I only learned that because I was listening to the radio like the day before and heard it, that it was going to mark the anniversary on that Saturday night. I think it was like May 21st or something like that. And so it felt like someone was kind of agreeing with us, you know, that it was the right thing to do.
It was Amelia.
It was Amelia or Mrs. Gallagher. I mean.
I think we just got time for, we've just got one last question, if that's okay, before we finish. So does the seemingly impenetrable economic structure make you angry, and is showing these women's stories and making art about it the gentle protest we must make to help shift the system? What a great question. Thank you so much for that question. That's now you have to answer that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you know, it does, it, you know, you know, why it begs the question, why do we need a feminist economics? Why is economics not, you know, serving us all? If this is a system of analysis and, you know, that we're all adhering to, and, you know, that public policy is being formed around. So the fact that there's, you know, basic principles of like this notion of rational economic man, you know, also that the idea of like, you know, there's all kinds of things that you can start thinking about when you start questioning premises in sort of, you know, economic theory. And I'm certainly not an economist or an expert, but, you know, even the idea of like, how is a tree productive? Is it more productive being cut down and made into wood, or is it more productive making oxygen, you know, and being just being a tree? It's so, you know, there's notions of that, like what do we value, that come into play. And so certainly like this kind of invisible labor and this notion that women are sort of contributing to a system, you know, and I guess you'd call it sort of social reproductive theory, right? So going back to Marx and thinking about, you know, the children that are being raised and produced from the home by these women, which are not necessarily, they're not being paid, they don't earn a wage, they don't have a pension from doing that work, or then sort of feeding into a system as consumers, as producers. And so, you know, all of that needs to be sorted out. So I think the film is just a kind of, yeah, it's a gentle cry for help, or recognition. And it's a form of, you know, attention maybe to a sort of a space that's, we all know about and are talking about with COVID, you know, especially in lockdown, and thinking about the division of labor in homes, and, you know, what thought, you know, so all of this is quite, it's present, right? But what are we going to do about it, you know? So that's sort of where the film leaves, like, at least for me, it's more about proposing, what do you think about this situation? What do you think about these women's lives, or what you've noticed when you've seen, you know, you've watched what they do? Is it valuable? What sort of world do we want to live in? And what are those values that we want to sort of uphold and reward and share? Easy, right? Let's just sort it out tomorrow.
I was thinking, yeah, about the way, you know, that maybe the film encourages a certain kind of attention, but also that it sort of produces its own terms and horizons. So I think, you know, there is a kind of gentleness, perhaps. There's a kind of sort of serious care with which you kind of attend to your subjects, Margaret, but I wonder if gentle isn't quite the right way to sort of word it, because I feel like there's so much at stake for you in the, you know, in filmmaking and what it might sort of offer in terms of this kind of expansion of a kind of horizon. Like, I think, you know, there's the sort of horizon of economics and there's the horizon of feminism, right? But there's also the horizon of film that Icarus and really your other work is kind of is sort of opening up.
Yes, yeah. I think it's as much about kind of what's not there as what is there, right? So it's kind of you know, the forward motion is happening, whether, you know, and so in the films that I'm making, it's more about kind of pushing that and risking and going out and striving to sort of to, you know, to go beyond what expectations are, and so, you know, each film is a kind of marker of some sort of sense of a challenge or some sort of trying to do something more. And so I think, you know, I hope that that's exciting also for people to see and to, and for people to be a part of, you know. And so, like, certainly, I suppose the gentleness is part of a sort of form of like friendship and kinship that's sort of in the film, you know, which is like wanting, you know, like seeing that we're, you know, some of the women, we were having fun, or, you know what I mean? It wasn't all, yeah, it was also sort of celebration of who these women were, right? Or are. But yeah, I mean, my hope is that it sort of just opens up a kind of a dialogue with different, you know, about, or is part of a dialogue, right? So there's like this dialogue's been going on for quite a while, but it's part of a kind of conversation and just another kind of point along a kind of set of intentions, which is hopefully moving us, you know, forward into, you know, a higher awareness of what's going on and how we want to live. Yeah.
I really don't want to stop us. This is such an amazing conversation. I feel really privileged to be part of it. So, but I feel like we've probably run out of time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Margaret and Laura, this has been a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for sharing. It's amazing to hear an artist talk about their work in that kind of way. It feels like, you know, it's so wonderful to have you to experience the films, but also then to hear you talk about your work is just a kind of wonderful experience. So thank you very much for spending time with us, and thank you, Laura, for that conversation. It's just been great to hear it, to listen to it, and I'm sure everybody here feels the same. So thank you so much for joining us, and also again for letting us show the films. I can't wait to see what you're going to make next. I mean, like, I'm just feeling like everything you've just said. Okay, right, the next film is, we're going to answer some of those questions.
So thank you, and to everyone who's supporting Sammy and Andrew, our captioner, and Selena, who's in the audience maybe somewhere.
Yeah, Selena's there. Yeah. So yeah, thanks to you, and thanks for everybody who joined us now. And if you're watching it later, thank you very much. Thanks again to you both.
Okay, bye.
Bye.